here as we continue understanding the Old Testament. And boy, as we begin tonight and just do a little bit of review, we find out that over these last number of weeks and months, we have covered a lot of ground because we started in Genesis, which is the very beginning of the Old Testament, obviously, and we have now arrived at the third of the four major prophets, being Ezekiel. And so we're looking forward to that tonight as we continue seeing the prophetic message that God had for his people during the time not only prior to that captivity, but what is significant about Ezekiel's prophecy is that his prophecy was during the captivity. So that gives you a little bit of a switch in the history context of our understanding of the Old Testament. When we're dealing with Isaiah and Jeremiah, they were ministering before the captivity. Ezekiel is the one who ministers during the captivity. And so that is one of those unique things about Ezekiel. And so while we begin this, let's begin with this point right off the bat. When God sent his people into exile as punishment for their sin, he still continued to speak to them. And this is very important because we do know that between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, God was silent, right? But during this time of exile, God was continuing to speak to his people, and he would again do that through his prophets. Among the Jews taken captive by King Nebuchadnezzar, you were mentioning a little earlier, Clark, about that unique name, right? Yeah. So during the captivity of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, it was in his second invasion of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah twice. It was during his second invasion in 597 where he came across Ezekiel. All right, and Ezekiel was one of the ones that was taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar. And it would be Ezekiel who God would choose to be his prophet to the exiles. Daniel, who would be coming along later, Daniel served as God's ambassador to the court of the captive king, but Ezekiel would be the one that would serve during the captivity as well. So it was during the captivity years that some of the Jews returned to God. Remember, God always promised that he would return a remnant of his people back to the land after the exile was done. And it was during the captivity that some of these Jews indeed did return to God. It was under Ezekiel that we believe very strongly that Ezekiel was the one that began what we would call today Judaism, right? There's no temple, right? There's no sacrifices, and so on. Because of the captivity, Jerusalem has been destroyed. And the religion of Judaism, the sect of Judaism, would have been started under Ezekiel. He was the prominent prophet at this time. In fact, you go back into the history of Ezekiel and you'll find that the Jewish people call Ezekiel the father of Judaism. All right, so if you've always, if you kind of had to wonder, modern day Judaism, where does that come from? It comes from the captivity, and it comes through Ezekiel. All right, so that gives you an idea of the significance of Ezekiel's ministry and the significance of this book as it's preserved for us in the Old Testament. 48 chapters in Ezekiel. So that's, again, that's the reason why we call him a major prophet. He had a lot to say, and a lot that he had to say was preserved for us. And by way of outline, what we've done with Ezekiel, which was 48 chapters, is we've divided it into three basic sections to help us as we would perhaps take time to read through this. First 24 chapters, Ezekiel talks about the fate of Judah. What was their fate? They were in captivity. God had promised, if you do not obey, you will be taken into captivity. There will be a nation that comes and takes you as a people away from your land. And that is exactly the fate that they suffered. And the first 24 chapters, Ezekiel talks about that. It's almost kind of like Ezekiel saying, I told you so. All right? And you know how much we enjoy people telling us, I told you so, after the fact, right? Ezekiel was kind of saying that in the first 24 chapters. When we go from chapters 25 through 32, we then talk about, or I should say, we don't talk about, but Ezekiel talks about the foes of Judah. All right? Those who were against Judah and against God and what it is that he wanted to do with his people. Chapters 33 through 48, the last portion of Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks about the future of Judah, where he talks about their return. He talks about what is going to be happening, not just in their current day, but Ezekiel also has in those chapters talking about the future of Judah in the end times, okay, or the Jewish nation in the end times, that which we have yet to experience in its fullness, all right? So that's why we would say that Ezekiel, being a prophet of the nation of Judah during the time that they are in exile, also contains with it, and we'll get into it a little bit later as we go, contains what we call apocalyptic literature. And we'll explain that a little later as we go. But before we get into the book itself, let's talk about the man. We've done this with Isaiah, we've done this with Jeremiah, and we'll continue to do it with Ezekiel. What do we know about this prophet? What do the scriptures share with us about this prophet? Well, let's first of all deal with his name. Ezekiel is a name that we come across sometimes, even in our North American culture, right? Or we sometimes shorten that to Zeke, right? We've heard that as well. What does his name mean? It means God strengthens. So, if you come across a family and they have a son and they've named him Ezekiel, that's what that name means. God strengthens. Now, how appropriate, right? Where is the nation of Judah during Ezekiel's ministry? They are in captivity. And what is God going to do during this time that they are in captivity? He will be strengthening the remnant, right? Because the remnant is going to return. Hence why this name is there. And Ezekiel, the prophet, was truly a tower of strength in the midst of a defeated people. Imagine being called to the ministry that Ezekiel was called to. He was called to minister to a defeated people. They thought that God had forgotten about them. They thought that God no longer cared for them. They were of the impression that God had left them to their own devices forever and ever, and there was no possibility of hope. There was no possibility of return. That's the kind of people that Ezekiel was called to. Now, think about this for a moment. How much do we enjoy talking with people who are always downers, right? Eeyore is what we would call Eeyore. Remember Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh character? Eeyore always looked at things negatively, right? This is the kind of people that Ezekiel now is ministering to. He's ministering to a bunch of Eeyores that are disillusioned and sorrowing over the captivity. Now, again, from the other perspective, they received what they deserved, right? God's only following through with the promise that he gave them, but yet Ezekiel's been called to minister to a people who feel defeated. And God made him strong to resist the opposition of a hard-hearted and rebellious nation. If you go to chapter 3 of Ezekiel, it's interesting how God describes these people and what Ezekiel will face. If you've ever heard about hard-headed people, this is where Ezekiel helps us here, or the Lord speaking through Ezekiel. Chapter 3 of Ezekiel, we'll pick it up in verse 8. Behold, I have made your face strong against their faces, and your forehead strong against their foreheads. Like adamant stone, harder than flint, I have made your forehead. Do not be afraid of them, nor be dismayed at their looks, though they are a rebellious house. Okay? So, basically what God is saying is this. You think they're hard-headed. Guess what? I've made you even more hard-headed. Okay? Describing the forehead being like a rock, or as strong as flint. So, talking about hard-headed people here, and God would make Ezekiel strong to resist the opposition that would come, because he would have a message of hope, while the people would continue to rebel and be hard-hearted. With regard to his birth, if the phrase in chapter 1, verse 1, that phrase 30th year, okay, if that phrase in verse 1 of chapter 1 refers to Ezekiel's age at that time, then we estimate he was born in 623 BC, And if that is the case, then Ezekiel was born during the reign of good King Josiah. Remember Josiah? With the tribe of Judah, right? He was one who brought about significant reformations, trying to bring the people of God back to the way in which they should be. And this would be the time that Ezekiel was born. And as a child, when the book of the law was recovered in the course of renovating the temple in 621 BC, Ezekiel would have been around for that. It is true. If you review your history again, you know that during the time of the Reformation that was taking place under King Josiah, he was refurbishing the temple, and in the whole renovation project that was taking place, one of the people on the work crew discovered the book of the law. And they brought it up, blew the dust off it, brought it out, and showed it to the king. And the king wanted it read. And it was through the influence, again, of the Word of God that these reformations and renovations would continue. So it was during the years of Ezekiel's boyhood and youth that he spent this time in what we would call the Bright Reformation period that followed the recovery under King Josiah. This would have been Ezekiel's experience growing up. He would remember those days, he would remember those years, and they would be used to influence his ministry later on. As far as his family, Ezekiel, like Jeremiah, was born of a priestly heritage. Okay? His father's name, here's another name for you, Clark, since you like those interesting names. His father's name was Buzi. Okay? And he also was a priest. We think possibly of the Zadok line. Okay? So if you really wanted to get into the details of the history of the priestly lines from Aaron being the first high priest, right? You could trace that back, and Buzi would be in the line of Zadok. And we know that Ezekiel was married. It's not known if he had any children, because the text never says, although we do know that he did have a wife. Because in Ezekiel's ministry, we would estimate this, that the two darkest days of Ezekiel's ministry came with, each of those came with an announcement. The first one, of course, was the siege of Jerusalem. In chapter 24, God talks with Ezekiel about the siege of Jerusalem and what was going to happen, and how it would be that how it was that the people came into captivity. The other tragic event that the Lord announces to Ezekiel in the same chapter, chapter 24, is he talks about the death of his beloved wife. Okay? So possibly I would say the two darkest days in Ezekiel's ministry. The Lord is involved in announcing that to him. And so that's how we know that Ezekiel was married, because of the fact that God announces to him the death of his wife. In exile is where we find the vast majority of Ezekiel's ministry. When he was about 18 years old, that would put us around 605 BC. When Ezekiel was about 18 years old, the Babylonians made their first invasion into Judea, carrying away some of the captives. And among those captives of the first invasion was Daniel. Okay? Now, we will find out the significance of this later. In fact, when we get together next time, what's our next book? Daniel. All right, and so we'll see the significance of Daniel's ministry. But Daniel was the one that was carried away by the Babylonians during the first invasion, and that's when Ezekiel was about 18. And it would be 8 years later, 597 BC, that the Babylonians would come again. And this time, Ezekiel was among the captives. And we believe, based upon historical record and what we see in the Old Testament text, that Ezekiel was part of what was called the upper classes of Judah. Okay, again, remember, priestly family, right? So that would bring him into those upper classes of Judah. Now, during this exile, some of the exiles were incarcerated. Some of them were made to be slaves. And what is surprising under King Nebuchadnezzar's rule was that many were allowed to settle down in their own homes, in various settlements of the exiles. It was kind of like refugee camps, so to speak, right? And as Jeremiah did, right? Remember, he encouraged the people, don't fight this, okay? Establish homes. You're not going to be able to beat them, so you might as well join them for now. And he told them to settle down. Ezekiel had somewhat of the same message, okay? And some of the people who came back in exile were even able to settle into their own homes. And so it was of divine providence that Ezekiel was among those who were granted such liberties. The liberties being that they would settle down in a home. Why? Because Ezekiel's home, this is what's significant now, Ezekiel's home was a meeting place, okay, where the Jewish elders would come to consult with him about what they should do next, what was God saying, all the rest of those things. So it was in Ezekiel's home where basically the meetings took place. God orchestrating everything, right? Just again, we found in the history of Israel where God was orchestrating everything when things were going well, and sometimes we get this misconception that when things weren't going well, when the divided kingdom came, things weren't going well, that God had basically taken his hands off of everything and they could just wallow in their own self-pity. No, we find that even during the time of the exile, during the time of the divided kingdom, all the rest of that, what is God doing? He's busily involved in the orchestration of what's going to take place, what's going to happen. Ezekiel was no exception to God's working among the people. That's why Ezekiel was called to his prophetic ministry. And we have in Ezekiel a little bit of information with regard to his call and his commission. It would be 5 years after his arrival in the strange land of Babylon when Ezekiel did receive his call to the prophetic office, and his call was specifically to minister to the exiles in Babylonia, those ones who were the Eeyores, right? They were disillusioned and depressed and all the rest of those things that come with being found in exile. It would be 22 years later, when Ezekiel was around 52 years old, that he is still prophesying to the exiles. Okay, so the same message over and over again for 22 years. All right? How's that for longevity? How's that for ministry? When his ministry concluded, we have no idea. The text doesn't tell us. Okay, and we don't even know how he died, but we do know that Ezekiel was one of those ones who did at least 22 years of ministry among a people who were hard-headed and rebellious. Now, I got to tell you, that's stick-to-itiveness, right? Because after a while, when we're dealing with hard-headed, rebellious people, what do we do after a while? Since they're acting like brick walls, why are we hitting our head against it, right? We get this opportunity, or we get this inclination to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. It wasn't Ezekiel. He kept on working with these people. That's why when we talk about Ezekiel's character, we talk about the fact that he was a prophet that was strong and fearless. Again, we saw in chapter 3 how God would describe his strength. And Ezekiel would be as well a fearless prophet in the factor of his message before people that were indeed hard-headed and rebellious. His book reveals that Ezekiel was one that was methodical. You can't do 22 years of prophetic ministry the way he did it without being methodical. But Ezekiel was also one who had an artistic bent, where he talked about things and talked about his visions that we'll talk a little bit about later, talked about his visions, and even did some demonstrative things that were different from the other prophets. That shows us not only his methodical bent, but his artistic bent, and a bit of a mystic too, because again, we'll get into this a little bit more later. He talks about the visions of God that he has, and when we read them, they're quite intriguing because we're kind of going, oh, this is weird. This isn't like anything we've ever seen or experienced before, but these were the visions that Ezekiel had, that God gave to Ezekiel. And, well, guess what? Even in our day and age today, we're still talking about Ezekiel's visions, right? One of the visions that he had that we're probably most familiar with is speaking to the Valley of Dry Bones. There's even been music set to that, right? Ezekiel in the Valley of the Dry Bones, right? And so this is Ezekiel is a unique prophet in his own right. So as far as his message was concerned, he had three basic points that he stressed, right? Well, a natural-born preacher, right? 3 points to his message. How does that work, right? 3 points in his preaching. One was this. It was a sin which brought the people's judgment in exile. Okay, so point number one basically being, again, I told you so. What you're experiencing, what you're going through, is simply a response to God's judgment upon you because of your sin. And so with that point in mind, he also was talking about the people's need to repent of their sinfulness and their need to return to God. The second point of his preaching, the exile. We know how long it's going to be. 70 years. Okay? So imagine, at the beginning of this, and as Ezekiel is sharing about his ministry, maybe you saw on the marquee sign outside the house, Ezekiel reveals how long the exile will be. And so you grab your family, you grab your friends, you buy your tickets, you go to the meeting, because Ezekiel's going to tell you how long the exile is going to be. And you're hoping that it's not going to be very long, because some of the other false prophets, okay, along with the exiles, are saying, this is just going to be a short-term project. And Ezekiel reveals it to you in the second point of his message. We're here for 70 years, folks, at least. So, buckle down, and let's get to work. We've got some work to do during that time. And so that was Ezekiel's second point in his preaching, and it was consistently throughout his ministry. Third point, there is going to be a future restoration of Israel. And this is not for everybody. This would be a future restoration of Israel that would be reserved for the believing remnant. And so that brought about Ezekiel's third point in his message. Are you going to be part of the remnant, or are you going to continue to be rebellious? Are you going to be part of the remnant, or are you going to continue to be hard-headed? And so all of those things involved in this message. So Ezekiel, as he preached, the tone of his messages was what we would call austere and impressive. He constantly stressed the Lord's sovereignty and glory. And again, being from a priestly home, this would be some of the training that he would have received in his preaching. But very austere, very impressive, and just like Jeremiah and Isaiah before him, just as rejected as well with regard to his message by most of the people. All right, so that's what we know about Ezekiel, the man. Let's talk a little bit now about his book, and let's start off with the style of writing. While it is true that most of the book of Ezekiel consists of direct addresses from the Lord, and they do. Ezekiel, this is what I want you to say. Ezekiel, this is what I want you to communicate. What's interesting about this is that the form and the style in which those words were recorded is the style of Ezekiel. All right? So, as God was using the prophet to directly communicate what he wanted to communicate, he did not violate Ezekiel's style of communication. He communicated it using Ezekiel's style. And so, again, Ezekiel apparently had very methodical habits, especially in recording events and dates. Okay, so he's one of those prophets that we like because he talks about dates to help us with an idea of the time period that we're looking at. And when you read about his visions, right, he's very methodical in recording what it is that he saw in those visions. In fact, let's talk about this, because this is the main idea in Ezekiel is these visions that he receives from God. In fact, we would say that Ezekiel was known as the prophet of visions. Jeremiah was known as the prophet of tears, remember? Right? Ezekiel would be known as the prophet of visions. Now, when we're talking about visions in the Bible days, in Ezekiel's day, what was a vision? Basically, a vision was this. This was a miraculous experience. This would be where the person of God, in this case being Ezekiel, the person of God would be on this special occasion, God would reveal truth to the prophet in some pictorial or audible form. You know how at night sometimes you might wake up from a dream that you're having, right? And it seems so real. But we live in a day and age where we take a look at that and we say, okay, that's just the fact of dreaming. The brain is calling things that it needs to call. This wasn't just a night dream that Ezekiel was having. This was a miraculous experience that Ezekiel was having with God, where God was revealing to him truth that he needed to know, and in turn, the people needed to know. And so there are several visions that are recorded in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel goes through great detail in them. We're not going to go through those visions in detail and talk about what they mean, because that's for you to study later, all right? But let's talk about some of these visions. The first one that's recorded for us is what we call the vision of the cherubim, or the vision of God. This was Ezekiel's inaugural vision, or his first vision. Then there is the vision of the roll, or the scroll, okay? Then we have what we call the vision of the plain, where he sees some interesting things there. And then he has some visions of Jerusalem. And we have 4 specific visions that relate to Jerusalem there. The first one being the 4 abominations of the temple is recorded for us in chapter 8, where the temple is violated, it is desecrated, the 4 abominations in the temple. The inhabitants of Jerusalem, he has a vision of the inhabitants of Jerusalem being slain. Okay? Remember, that's what happened at the fall of Jerusalem, right? The inhabitants were indeed killed. He has a vision where the city is destroyed by fire, okay, in chapter 10. And we know that that's exactly what happened with the city of Jerusalem. And we also see where in this 4th vision about Jerusalem, the Lord departs from the city. You've heard of Ichabod, right? The Lord has departed, okay? This is this part of this vision that takes place. Of course, again, the one that's probably most familiar to us is the vision of the dry bones, right? Where God restores and brings back the bones back together. It's the roots. It's the roots of the song that sometimes we sang when we were kids, right? The head bone's connected to the neck bone's connected to the shoulder bone, right? That comes originally from Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones. Okay, if you've ever wondered about that. Okay, so chapter 37 is where you'll find that. And then, of course, talking about more of his apocalyptic ministry, he also has visions of the new temple. And he's talking about the temple that would come at Christ's return, or at the setting up of his kingdom. So we have visions of the new temple and the associated scenes that all surround that, and that's chapters 40 through 48. So what's interesting about this book, as we read it, is it's full of visions, and it has all kinds of intriguing imagery in there that we're not at times quite sure what Ezekiel is referring to or what God is trying to communicate through Ezekiel in that. But Ezekiel becomes very meticulous in how he communicates what he sees in those visions. We also find that Ezekiel is one of the ones that was heavily involved in what we call symbolic actions. In fact, more than any other prophet, Ezekiel was one who taught by symbolic actions, those strange things which God asked his prophets to do in order that his messages might impress the people vividly and intensely. And so, if my memory is serving me correctly, one of the demonstrations that Ezekiel did was he was to lie on his side for, I forget how many months it was, that he was not allowed to get up, but he had to lie on his side. And as people watched him lying on his side, this was a demonstration of a particular message that God was giving. And now, again, Ezekiel wasn't the only prophet who did this, but he was the one that does it the most often in the prophets that are talked about in the Old Testament. So, with these symbolic actions, of course, he was continually exposing himself to the jeers and the scorn of the skeptical. What are you being so silly for, Ezekiel? Why are you doing this? All the rest of those things that would come along with these symbolic actions that he was doing. And as they would ask why he was doing it, he would say, because this is what the Lord has told me to do. and so that's some of the things that he had to work through. Of course, with these visions and so on, allegories are prevalent in the book of Ezekiel. What are allegories for, or what do they do? Well, they're stories intended to teach a spiritual lesson, right? It's not necessarily a true story, but it is a story that teaches a spiritual lesson. And Ezekiel uses allegories in his communication. He also uses apocalyptic imagery. Again, when he's talking about the new temple, again, that's the temple that is still to be established. It's the temple that's still to come. And this will come during the time when Christ returns again to earth. And so the last portion of Ezekiel, chapters 40 on, Ezekiel talks a lot about the apocalyptic nature of God and what he will do for his people. Being artistic as he was, we're not surprised that we find poems in Ezekiel as well. Okay, all part of the content of this book that Ezekiel writes. And so, as we take a look at this, we kind of get now a flavor of what Ezekiel was like as a particular individual, a little bit of his historical context, a little bit of what type of ministry he did, and the uniqueness of his ministry as well. Right, ministering again to people who are deflated and down, and through allegory and through poems and through apocalyptic imagery and through visions, he is trying to encourage the people and saying, listen, turn back to God, be part of the group that God has promised to return back to the land. Here's your opportunity. And so this is what Ezekiel does. But as we do with each of the books that we go through, let's ask the question again, the same with Ezekiel as we have with all the others, right? So what? Okay, we know this about Ezekiel. We know this a little bit about his book. What significance does it have for me as a follower of Christ in the day and age in which we live? Well, first of all, we learn more about our God through this book. We've been learning about God as we go through the Old Testament, but Ezekiel is, again, one of those books that helps us know a little bit more about his nature and his character. And so in this book, we are exposed again to God's glory and the way in which he ministers to his people, even in the midst of the fact that they are in exile. We see and are exposed to God's righteousness. We are exposed to his mercy. We are exposed to his judgment. We are even exposed to his desire and his plans for restoration. Okay, and so if we want to see how God works in the lives, or attempts to work in the lives of people who have basically turned their backs on him, this is a good book to go to see how God still deals with those who are hard-hearted, to deal with those who are rebellious. It's interesting. God does not give up on them. You and I would have a tendency to give up on these rebellious, hard-hearted people a long time ago. But we find that God doesn't. And Ezekiel shares with us that way, or that penchant that God has for bringing about restoration of the people that are rebellious. So we even see his patience, right? Which would be wrapped up, of course, in his mercy, dealing with the people that have rejected him for so long. Second thing that I think helps us to see the significance of Ezekiel is in this, The prophecies of Israel's future restoration. Well, you know what? If God is still wanting to work with a people that are rebellious against Him, and He's promising them a future restoration, what was God doing? He was giving them hope, right? He was giving them hope. We need to be reminded of that as well, I think. Sometimes we too, as we are involved in our walk with Christ, sometimes we get discouraged and sometimes we get down for whatever reason, right? God is not finished with us yet, and I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. That even though maybe we're going through what we would palatably call a rough patch, right, or a dry period, God continues to desire to work in our lives. God has not given up on us. He's continuing to do whatever it is He's doing, even though we don't see it necessarily, even though we aren't in tune with it fully. We remember that if God is one who has future plans for rebellious people, then obviously He has future plans for us as well. That should give us hope. That even though we're going through the dry period, or even though we're going through the rough patch, we do not give up on our walk with Christ. Why? Because we know He is still at work, even though we may not at this point see it or experience it. He's still at work, so we do not give up on that. That's I think, important for us, because that was Ezekiel's message to the people. God has not given up on us, even though it seems like He has. God hasn't given up on us. He has some plans that He has for us. And you too can be part of it. So don't give up. Continue going. Continue moving forward. Pursue God. Repent. Turn back to Him. Pursue Him. Because He's pursuing you. Well, I think that's a great reminder for us. That as we go through those rough patches, as we go through those dry periods, we continue to pursue Christ. Because He continues to pursue us. So, Ezekiel, an interesting prophet, to say the least, and brings some fun reading for you, especially when you get into the visions. That should be some fun reading for you. Just trying to figure some of that out. It is intriguing in that sense. So, as you take the opportunity to read Ezekiel, enjoy that. And when we get back together again, we will take a look then at the fourth of our four major prophets. We will look at Daniel. So let's pray together. Father, thanks again for your goodness to us and for your word. Father, as we have been going through each book methodically, we have been reminded again of your love for us. We've been reminded again of your plan for us. We have been reminded again of the fact that you are the one who continues to be in control. So, Father, cause us, as your people, to respond in such a way that would declare again your reality, that would declare again your presence in our lives. Thank you for Ezekiel. And bless us as we take more time in it, in our own personal times. And we pray this in Jesus' name.